As I said, this is going to be a little bit unorthodox, but we do have a story to tell. And I think it is a good extension of our sermon last Sunday. But before we do that, I want to give you a piece of advice. Always double knot your shoelaces. So with athletic tennis shoes, I always, for some reason, I had a great aunt that taught me one time on how to tie a shoestring so it wouldn't come undone for the kids. And so I usually do that, but then I don't like the shoestrings flopping on my shoes, so I would always double knot them. There's a point to that, and we'll get to it eventually. But so that's my first bit of advice this morning. But if you remember our sermon, our message last Sunday, we talked a lot about God being in control and God's will being different than our will. And if we were writing the script, we would do it completely different. We talked some about the loss of David and Odetta, the circumstances that surrounded that, and there's not one of us that would have written that story the way it occurred. And then we talked about our church, the struggles that we've gone through the past few years, and how if we were writing the script, that's not what we would have done. That's not the way we would have done it. But we also read today's scripture in Proverbs about trusting in the Lord with all our heart and not leaning on our own understanding. When we finished last Sunday, so we'd made it through a couple pretty rough weeks. We had scheduled some time in Oklahoma, Texas. Margaret wanted to go down to Waco to see the magnolia stuff. And so we had scheduled a few days. So we left last Sunday right after church. And our intent was just to try to decompress, try to relax. Seemed like a good plan. And it was a beautiful day when we left. Sun was shining. We like road trips, and everything was going great, just like we'd scripted it. We stopped for lunch. I don't know what it was. It was supposed to be like a 10-hour drive, 9-hour drive, something like that. So we were probably 6 or 7 hours into the drive. And again, it was a beautiful day. Margaret had bought a new CD of Matthew West, so we had that cranked. And we were looking forward. We were 2 or 3 hours away from our destination, I think. And so we're driving down I-35, 75 miles an hour. I probably had the cruise probably at 78. And we're going along, and the rest of this, I've been told, because I don't remember. But we were driving down the interstate. And Margaret looked over at me, and she said something looked odd. And I turned to her, and I said, I don't know where we are. I don't know what we're doing. And then my body seized up. And everything went stiff, and my right foot was on the accelerator. And you can interrupt me if I get this wrong. But so we were doing 78, I know before that. I don't know how fast we got going. But in the van, there's a console between the passenger seat and the driver's seat, so it's not like she could just come over and take control. So somehow, she's keeping the van, she has her hand on the steering wheel, keeping the van on the road, and reaching down and trying to pull my leg off of the accelerator. She tried several times. It finally got a hold of my shoelaces and was able to yank hard enough to get my foot off of the accelerator. Again, I have no recollection of any of this. Once she was able to do that, the van eventually coasted. She got off onto the shoulder, kind of into the grass. There was an exit coming up. And she thought maybe she would make the exit, that there'd be enough power. Again, she's still in the passenger seat, and I'm in the driver's seat. And it didn't quite make it to the exit, but it was still a blessing, because by the time the van stopped, I had passed out. And she had time to call 911. And when she called 911, she could tell them exactly we're at exit number such and such. And they said, we'll have someone there in 2 minutes. Well, in the meantime, I woke up and was in, well, I had no idea where I was, but I was in a tremendous amount of pain, and I was trying to get out of the van. But we're sitting on the interstate with traffic flying by at 80 miles an hour. So somehow she wrapped an arm around this arm and held me in the van until the sheriff could get there. And evidently I argued with the sheriff too when he got there. But I don't remember any of that. I do remember arguing with somebody because I couldn't breathe. I couldn't function. All I knew was I was in pain and I had to get out of the situation I was in. But again, she somehow kept me inside the van. When the sheriff showed up, and she told him, just don't let him out of the van, again, because of the trapping. So anyway, somehow they got me into an ambulance. Again, so this happened late Sunday afternoon. I don't recall anything until Monday afternoon sometime. But I think they gave me shots to try to calm me down. Anyway, we're in the hospital at Ardmore, Oklahoma. And so what happened is I had a seizure while I was driving. And we found out 2 days later that during the seizure, somehow I broke my back in 3 different places. And that was what was causing the pain and why I couldn't breathe. I think they thought I just couldn't breathe, so I was on oxygen the whole time I was there, and that really wasn't the issue. But, so on Monday afternoon, they had ordered MRIs and just to see what caused the seizure, what all was going on. And that's the first real memory I have, is trying to get out of bed. And I mean, they just wheeled a wheelchair in, said, here, climb in here, we'll take you to MRI. I couldn't move. I could not stand up. And then during the MRI is when they discovered that there were 3 broken vertebrae in my back. Again, you can't make this stuff up. They did a thyroid test, and the thyroid readings were off the chart. And one of the nurses suggested that or said it could have been a thyroid storm, which is fatal in itself. The seizure could have been fatal. Obviously, going down the highway could have been fatal. But none of it was. It was not what we scripted. That was not what we had intended for our week of trying to recuperate. But I think there's a reason for it. Well, so to continue the story, and then I'll get back to the message. But one thing that I've realized over this past week is you never know where you're going to find God. We had two nurses, a nurse and a nurse's aide, and they were the highlight of our hospital stay. I mean, they were just wonderful people, both young, and they don't normally work together. And they worked together 3 days while we were there. And they made all the difference. I mean, the rest of it was not a pleasurable experience by any means. But I think God put them there during that time. One of the first things I remember was our son Brad walking into the hospital room. He didn't call and say, well, I don't think. He didn't call and say, should I come? He just was there. And just little things since then. Keisha showed a picture last night of 2-year-old Baker with her hands folded. Sorry. Or Grayson last night. They'd been there a while, and he said, "Pops, did you hurt your back?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "I have this brace on now." And he said, "You can take that off. You just need a Band-Aid." He said, "Just hang out with Dad and put a Band-Aid on it, and you'll be fine." But it's those little things, completely unexpected. I don't know how Margaret did it this week. But again, it's not, we thought we had a good plan. We thought we were going to go rest, and it was anything but that. So our plans for last week were relaxing a few days, just having some quiet time, trying to recharge, no responsibility, and just unwind. But those weren't God's plans. But when we look back on this week at God's plans were miracle after miracle after miracle. We met new people. That one of the nurses, when they checked us out, she was struggling not to cry. This is somebody I didn't know 2 days before that. You don't know how important our church family is through situations like this. But if you remember our message last week, and how important it is just to trust in the Lord. This whole week just seemed like an extension of that message. That regardless of what we think we need or where we think things should go, we need to trust in God. I think it was Palm Sunday. The message that I gave was on, was when Jesus was telling his disciples what was going to happen to him. And he did it 3 times in a row because they weren't quite getting it. And if you remember, there was an enacted parable. I mean, we all know that Jesus uses parables to teach us. Well, there was what's called an enacted parable because Jesus went to heal the blind man, and he didn't quite get him to where he could see. He could see people, but he said it looked like trees walking until he did it again. And he used that parable to show that the disciples knew who Jesus was, but they didn't quite comprehend why he was here and what he was going to accomplish. I've had a lot of time to think, laying in bed for the past few days, and in some ways I think what happened this week could be seen as an enacted parable for us. So I finished the message last week, and I felt good about getting the message across that we need to continue to trust in God. His ways are not like our ways. We always need to look to him. And it's almost like God said, okay, let's see if you believe that. And so the events of this week took place. You know, again, this isn't anything like what we would have asked for, what we would have scripted. We have a lot of unanswered questions. Because I had a seizure, now I can't drive for at least 6 months. We've got a doctor's appointment with an orthopedic surgeon on Thursday to see what to do about my back. We don't know what happened with the thyroid. There are just a lot of unanswered questions. I will say, a couple weeks ago, it was shortly after it was, I think, the Monday after David Nodetta's death. I woke up and I was confused, kind of like what I was asking Margaret while I was driving. But it was like all the stress points in my life I couldn't comprehend. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what was going on. I asked her, did somebody die? And this was 3 days after losing her brother. I said, am I supposed to be finishing an essay for school, which I had finished the night before, and I was up late. But it was like all of those stress points, and I think that may have contributed to some of this. But there are a lot of questions. But with all of that, I don't want this to be a depressing message, because I walked up here without my walker. And laughter may be a powerful medicine. It's also sometimes painful under the right circumstances. So. But there has been a lot of laughter in the past few days. There's just been a lot of appreciation for what God has done in our lives. And I want us as a church to take that same approach moving forward. If we use this as an enacted parable, that God's trying to teach us through this, that no matter what the circumstances, no matter how dire it seems at the time, God has a plan for us. And I told you last Sunday, I firmly believe this. God's changing us as individuals. He's changing us as a church. And we just need to be open to what His plans are. And I think we'll be amazed at the results. And I apologize for the message today. It's kind of rambling. But it was a story that I wanted to share because it was pretty powerful in our lives, obviously. Our lives are completely different than they were the last time I was up here. And it's amazing how quickly that changed. Brad took way too much pleasure in buying things like walkers and back braces and shower chairs. And he didn't buy Depends, so I think he knew that was crossing the line. But anyway, thank you for listening. Again, I think there are great things in store for us. I think God has tremendous plans for each of us and for us as a church. And I look forward to what that will be. And we just have to be able to take that step and say that we trust you, and we'll follow you wherever you lead us. So the last song today, when I heard this, if you listen to the words, this is exactly how I have felt the past week, good and bad. But Logan, whenever you're ready, the last